Hi, everybody. Welcome back. And sorry, we're a little bit behind. So I'm going to do a little speed run today to get us caught up. So, what we're going to cover is we talked a little bit about Bauhaus and those revolutions. We'll talk about what happens to Dada when it ends up in Paris, in New York. It is not political in the same way that it was when it was in Germany. It's concerned with wider cultural criticism, some Freud, automatic writing, the stuff that Surrealism will be interested in. And in particular, we're looking at the work of Marcel Duchamp called LHOOQ. Remember, Duchamp himself is French. This is a postcard that he has written letters on and drawn a goatee and mustache on to retitle this image when read aloud in French. It sounds like she has LHOO, cool, a hot ass. For real. That's what it says. And how would you know what her ass looks like? We can't see anything. We are only looking at the front of her. This shows Dada's attitude toward tradition and also picks on the cult of the masterpiece and the then forbidden notion that Leonardo da Vinci was, of course, a master of arts because the Dadas questioned who any of the masters was. But he also is hinting at his curiosity with gender roles and constrictions. This is Marcel Duchamp as a young man. And on the right, you'll see that he creates an alter ego who is female called Rose C'est la vie, as in C'est la vie in French, meaning that's life. And as he says when he's interviewed about Rose Lévy, that she was born around 1920, I wanted to change my identity. And the first thing that came to me was to take a Jewish name. Why not find a Jewish name that I especially liked or that tempted me and that I suddenly had an idea? Why not change my sex? It was much simpler. So the name Rose Lévy came from that. So kind of an odd story, but there you go. He had business cards printed up with the profession being precision oculist, or the oculist also connects to rotary discs and films that he made called anemic cinema, which anemic is cinema spelled backwards. Duchamp switched to Rose in her activities here posing marks a shift in his work from his interest in the mechanical to his concern for the optical. And also we'll notice that Rose C'est la vie ends up on these bottles of perfume called Beautiful Breath, Veil Water. And I might mention that if you had beautiful breath, you would not be veiling it with perfume. But he also creates this nice case that itself has, of course, the logo that has Marcel Duchamp on it. Marcel Duchamp, of course, is the Dadaist that brought us this artwork, which is a large piece of glass with different figures, a bride at the top emitting love gas, as you might remember from Arts 150, as the bachelors who can't get to her are frustrated by this pane of glass and they grind chocolate together using this chocolate grinder. Now we know that because Duchamp creates a diagram for this artwork, which actually looks like this in real life, as you see it in the museum in Philadelphia. Incidentally, grinding chocolate in French culture was another way of talking about masturbation. So there you go. And Duchamp creates a diagram and tells us that's exactly what it's about, which is not exactly what most high art and fine art artworks were like or about at all. Another thing that kind of happened that is pretty cool is Duchamp allows his best friend, Man Ray, who he spends a lot of time playing chess with, to photograph dust breeding on the large glass because that is a little play of chance playing through. And if you look very closely at the real thing in Philadelphia, you'll see that it is pretty dirty in there, but that is entirely on purpose. But it looks like kind of a lunar landscape. It's pretty cool. All right. Now, he also is the one who, at the first papers of Surrealism exhibition in New York, takes 16 miles of string and strings up the gallery, blocking people's way from different artworks and just generally kind of being a little bit of a brat, which we love him for. And here's his friend Man Ray, who creates something called the rayograph, which is a contact print. And here we see contact prints of objects that we know. Man Ray was really named Emanuel Radinsky, who would be also in New York with Marcel Duchamp, and they would play a good deal of chess together. But in the rheograph, Man Ray would take an ordinary object and transform it into something the human eye might not ordinarily see, which appeals to the Dada's loves for the unexpected and its pictorial belief in the unexpected appearing in the everyday. So here we have, sorry about my dog, a little egg beater, some flowers, and who knows what else. But he also rolls over into surrealism quite easily. Surrealism begins in the 1920s, as I'll discuss in a minute, and the Dada's very easily slide into it because of their interest in the unconscious and the subconscious, but also this belief that things can be a couple things at the same time, like Man Ray's photograph of this object could be, yes, a neck if you're looking at a person with their chin slung back, but it also could be another body part altogether. Okay, so they love this idea that there is an unresolved set of possibilities. So surrealism kicks in, particularly in Paris in the 1920s. The lead manifesto writer, who was the one who wrote about what the movement was about, was a writer named André Breton. It began as a literary movement, but will very naturally find itself in the fine arts and even in photography. It will concern itself with the reconciliation of the rational and irrational sides of existence and lots of binaries, like the dream state versus the reality, the childlike versus the adult state, deliberation versus chance, and many, many more. But you'll notice that the surrealists are under absolutely no orders to make all of this make sense. They just love the chaos that that creates. And that includes chaos that sometimes involves sexuality, violence, lifelike forms that are not recognizably lifelike, weird sort of juxtapositions of things like Salvador Dali's lobster telephone that you see on the right, and objects that sometimes are considered to be somewhat violent or even anti-female. Now, this is a view of the Surrealist Gallery of the Art of this Century from 1940 without the string. And you can see that there were objects of all sizes. And we have sculptures as well as three-dimensional objects even pushed away from the wall. So the white cube as we know it as an exhibition space has not quite taken over yet. And here we have Man Ray's contribution. But he also gives us these doppelgangers of body parts that are repeated, geometricized. Sometimes bodies are even drawn on. And here's some Man Ray again, who gives us a minotaur, which is actually a human chest. But if you look at it as if it were a bull, it does look, and this is a man's upper torso transforming into the head of a bull from the Greek myth about the Minotaur, who was a half man, half bull creature to whom the Athenians sent young men and women for sacrifice on the island of Crete as they got caught in the labyrinth. But the Minotaur in that myth, the Minotaur was the name of the Surrealist magazine. And this photograph became the cover of one of those magazines because it could be a human body, but also could be about the sacrifice and death and the myth of the Minotaur. They could be both of those things at the same time. Now, Belmer was born in the German-dominated part of Poland, adds mismatched, sort of semi-mangled, distorted mannequin parts to create this grotesque that he also paints over. Now, I remember he would have been familiar with Nazi propaganda posters and creates these sort of anti-idealized bodies, which always have this kind of uncomfortable edge between the adolescent girl, innocent and virginal, and things that are jarringly erotic. But also notice that it kind of triggers all of the Freudian anxieties. And here is just one that's all about breasts. Other surrealists like Ubak, who's we're suddenly looking at, creates this brûlage print, which has these slippery looking dissolving forms that have like sort of a transitory quality that was very experimental, by the way. And we also have Claude Cahun, who was born female, but dresses herself as a man and creates, again, more gender conversations like we saw in Duchamp and Rose Lavie. Now, Dora Maar, who unfortunately is more well known as one of the former girlfriends of Pablo Picasso, here gives us a close up of an armadillo, disturbing, odd, and kind of weirdly extraordinary. And we see that it's called Papa Ubu from the movie, or I'm sorry, the theatrical performance Ubu Roy, that's Uburoi, which is about a king dressed in this giant sort of white, peaked, almost KKK robe looking like thing, but far before that. And he walked on the stage and just said the word shit over and over and over again. And that was super shocking. And the surrealists love that shock. A man named Versailles finds these things on the streets of Paris and photographs them, looking quite extraordinary, like this involuntary sculpture made of a theater ticket. But Versailles also walks the streets of Paris, like Toulouse-Lautrec, is introducing himself and his camera to people that he might not otherwise meet. That creates the viewer and subject in uncomfortable positions. And there's this sort of psychological tension, the power, sort of the wondering what kind of moment we've caught at this woman who's all by herself and drinking in the bar, and who is she waiting for? But he also will photograph outside in Paris and go out and catch the prostitutes working the streets at night. So we have sex workers on the streets, and that it's kind of dark and seedy, and Paris at night is just his thing. And he creates an entire book all about it, showing you sort of how the city has another reality at night. Now along comes André Cortege, a Hungarian-born artist who would be a mentor to Versailles, whose work we just saw, who distorts the human figure using funhouse mirrors, which makes these very surrealist distortions of this butt dropping all the way to the ground. And here we have these dancers, or a dancer kind of dancing satirically, echoed by this strange truncated sculpture to the side. Okay. Cortege here shows us an old neighborhood in Paris. Notice the train is crossing while a man carries a package, wraps a newspaper across in the other direction. Um, and Cortege looks at these weird coincidences where you have several things going on at once, which he believed spoke to an uncanny alchemy underlying ordinary events, which is very surrealism. And then we have Ache, who who was a neighbor of Man Ray's in Paris. Man Ray published a lot of Ache's street scenes in surrealist magazines. Ache just roams the street of Paris and took close to 10,000 or more photographs of a non-pictorialist view that he called documents that were unsettling and evocative, with headless mannequins and oddly more freaky headed mannequins showing you menswear for sale. And a featured artist that many of you have probably heard of already is André Cartier-Bresson, whose work I talked about a little bit before for its reference to the decisive moment. He was a painter, a student of art history. Go, yay! Influenced more by surrealist theories of the unconscious than by surrealist art practice. And he liked the idea of the spontaneous expression and intuition, and how we have a man that appears to be suspended, that Cartier-Bresson stood there and waited for someone to decide that they were going to try to jump that unsuccessfully. And here we see the man just the speck of a second before he falls into the water, and that is unsuccessful. So he's suspended in this decisive moment where fate hasn't quite played through. But we also catch Cartier-Bresson showing us sex workers who are doing sort of unglamorous, sort of ungraceful things. And that brings us finally to the end of our revolutions, beginning with photography engaging the masses, embracing technology with constructivism and Bauhaus, creating ruptures in graphs, signification systems for political purpose in data, finding new and strange worlds within our own in surrealism. So palette cleanse for just a moment. All right. And then that will take us to something different. Okay. So our next subject is to talk about FSA and what happens in the 1930s, moving to the Americas when the Great Depression takes effect. The Farm Security Administration, or before they were called that, they were the Resettlement Administration, was part of FDR's New Deal. So what happened was the stock market crashed on October 24th, 1929, and wiped out more than 60% of the value of securities, set off a chain of bank failures, factory shutdowns, and mortgage foreclosures. This ended the sustained growth of the 1920s, and economic conditions worsened. In 1932, which was a peak of it, 1 in every 4 workers was unemployed at a time when most families depended on the money of one breadwinner per family. This was the year that Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office. In America, the Depression was seen as an assault on the notion of America as a land of limitless opportunity for anyone who wants to roll up their sleeves and work. There was a concern that capitalism had failed and America needed to recoup itself in its system. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who just got the job of president, started a recovery plan called the New Deal. He's had a series of fireside chats that inspired a nation that was then on its knees and wanted to persuade conservatives who frequently questioned the necessity of these programs that gave aid to poorer people. He wanted to persuade them that what he was doing was pro-American and not anything to worry about. So at the time, there were some people who were pushing back about welfare programs like the New Deal. By the way, you'll notice that in photographs of FDR, we almost always see him seated. That is because he was wheelchair bound. After being stricken with polio in 1921, there was a gentleman's agreement, a very rare photograph of him in a wheelchair, as you see in the upper right-hand corner, and a statue in DC of him in the chair because of that lack of visibility. Now, it was sort of there were some exceptions, but most people did not want the American president's image to be weakened by any kind of specter of bad health. But of course, he did not necessarily. Remember, this is before TV. He only ever appeared on radio. He was a brilliant orator, as you can see in his fireside chat there, which is broadcast to the nation. So a lot of people in the country had no idea he even had a disability, which is pretty amazing. So under the New Deal to rouse support from the public for giving and being generous with others to help other people who were less well off, he created a documentary photography project, and it was as some said, with a bunch of photographers, sociologists with cameras, and a lot of their work became very famous. Dorothea Lange is coming up, as will Walker Evans and a few other photographers whose work you've seen. Okay, FSA was started in 1935, led by Roy Stryker. It had a staff of about 20. Its mission was to use photography to reassure the public that capitalism had not completely collapsed and that FDR's social programs would lead us back to recovery. These images were used free of charge. They could be cropped, edited, whatever you wanted to, by anybody. And today, the Library of Congress owns them, and you can download them and use them as you wish. Lots of publications consequently did, and they recontextualized them any way they wanted to. And I'll show you some examples of how that goes awry sometimes. Now, their goal was to find simple, persuasive, iconic images that could speak to the American people. Now, this is an example of one such image of people waiting for relief checks. Now, this was an ideological program, not a documentary program. And here's Roy Stryker, the leader. who told everyone to go out with a script. And by that, I mean find poor who are suffering and photograph them. But Roy Stryker would said he would send people out to different areas and assign them different images on different roles and write down the captions, send them to DC where they would be processed. Stryker would then look at the photographs, and if they were not to be used, they would somewhat tragically punch a hole straight through the middle of and kill the image. Or if they were usable, they would be printed, captioned, and kept. Roy Stryker was also an econ professor previously at Columbia and created a board game similar to Monopoly. And in fact, it hardly ever gets any attention because he's far more well known for his FSA contribution. But companies turned down the rights to buy the rights for the game. They said it was a folk game and not very unique. However, it would become, at the hands of Milton Bradley, a very important game. Okay, so Stryker is not a photography guy. He's more of a board game guy, but he finds his fame because he's the boss of all of these artists. And we'll talk about them one at a time, starting with Walker Evans. So Walker Evans' earlier work is New York and its people. And sometimes it's not very flattering. Sometimes guys just have their mouths open or they're in the middle of eating or drinking. Sometimes we have this womb to tomb sort of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, not of course Bethlehem in the Holy Land, where we see a landscape with dark, sort of coal-ridden skies and all kinds of electrical lines and factories dominating the image, which also, because of the cemetery, references death and biblical references. So we see this modern day grim equivalent of the fatal progression of life, work, and death with no people. The objects just speak for the lives of the people and the restricted nature of them. And this is what many of these look like when they're repackaged in books and juxtaposed with text. Sometimes the text over heroicizes them. Now, this was the beginning of a shoot that Evans would do for Fortune magazine with a writer named James Agee, who is a poet. And it would be published in the form of a book called Now Let Us Praise Famous Men from 1941. The irony was, of course, that none of them were famous. The book lost money, but the history was much more kind to it. It featured Hale County, Alabama, cotton farmers and chronicled their lives. So for a brief period, Walker Evans lived with a family called the Gudgers, who are renamed the Burroughses. So we see that Allie Mae Burroughs was actually Annie Mae Gudger in real life. But we see her posed against weathered, unpainted clapboards, prematurely wrinkled face, hard times, but her fortitude, her strength against the odds, all of that exemplifies Evans's style, the mass of detail, but then also juxtaposition of the pattern, for example, of her shirt versus the pattern and stripes of the wood back behind her. There's an objectivity that feels very honest and straightforward, but we also read this very quickly as a type or as an entire kind of people and not an individual, which might also is part of this becoming an icon aspiration of these photographs. So her husband, and I believe she was 34, but obviously aging beyond her years because of the hard economic times. This is Floyd Burroughs, originally named George Gudger, and he has been sort of, as he looks with this steely expression straight at the viewer, kind of challenging you to speak to the fortitude of him in the face of hardship. However, there's a J. Crew catalog version of him, as you see on the right, in which he has more of a comforting, connecting expression that makes him look less weary, less cynical. So the story goes that George Gudger wants nobody's pity. He's raising his children as a sharecropper, and he and Ally Mae Burroughs will just eke by barely and barely have enough food to eat, but they become types in this celebration of famous men. Okay, so a little bit later, Evans moves on to Birmingham, Alabama, and shows us his interest in vernacular flat signs and commercial culture, which he believed was an American national predicament because it brought spending and all of that brought this tendency for the market to collapse and then the shortage of money. Now, by the way, Stryker was a little heavy-handed with his shooting scripts and assignments, and Evans would frequently push back, and which is why he would be fired in 1937. And now this is after Evans is fired. He photographs in New York, and you'll notice commercialism signs in the US city, and even taking a hidden camera to the New York City subway, a camera that was located in his cane, which allowed him to capture the eternal view of people sitting on the subway or train or doctor's office or waiting in line. We all have that look of boredom on our faces that is somewhat eternal that we all share. Okay, new subject. Arthur Rothstein was stationed in the Midwest, and he got to experience the Dust Bowl, which is where all of these ceaseless winds in 1936 in the sand-drenched landscape turned farmable land into essentially a flood of dust at a time when that really was the last thing the Midwest could bear during the Great Depression. It left lots of land in ruins, lots of people with no income, made food more scarce for the rest of the country. So Rothstein here shows a father and some sons in Oklahoma running back to their home. And there are other photographs here of the little boy. And over time, there are a number of other photographs that suggest that he is staging this and having the people run back and forth. So there were some questions about the veracity of these photographs. And by the way, this is my grandfather's photograph of this event, which was a postcard that he got of the Dust Bowl over Kansas, which he lived through when he was a young man. On the back of these, this is how you would get your news photographs. There would be a long caption, and you would have this in your album, which is where he kept his, to show, did sort of keep to commemorate that event. Okay, now probably the most famous of all of the photographers of FSA was Dorothea Lange, who once went so far as to admit that she tried to capture not an image, but a mood. She was interested with very little experience previously in photography in its ability to reveal inequalities and to argue in a very subtle way for social change. She had a bit of a reputation for being a solid documentary photographer. She was married to an activist economist, Paul Taylor, who would travel on some of this work trip with her, some of these work trips with her. She focused her efforts on the plight of migrant farm workers who were the hardest hit. You'll notice very often there is a linear quality, a geometry to her work, in which you see these furrows in the field juxtaposed with the horizontal horizon line leads you to this desolate little farmhouse. It's formally very gorgeous, but also fairly tragic to see these empty fields. And here we see Filipino immigrants cutting lettuce, which would be backbreaking work. As you can see, the land is so parched that it is cracked. This also might remind us of the 19th century photographs from French realism, which with a gleaning underclass that fell on hard times. But the idea of Lang's photographs was these faceless types would play on our empathy. Now, by far, the biggest story about empathy is Lang's migrant mother. In Migrant Mother, Lang, as it goes, it was a Friday and she was ready to go home for the weekend. She had been reassigned to desk duty and she was ready to be done. So she gets in her car and she drives by and she sees this woman with a baby in her arms and some kids, and they're in this lean-to tent and they seem to be stuck by a pea pickers camp. So she keeps driving because it's Friday and it's 5 and she wants to get home. And then keeps thinking about this woman. She decides, according to the story, to turn around, go back, and she shoots 5 images. And these are the ones that she shoots of this woman in her tent. Okay, becomes a very famous photograph to us today. We know it as Migrant Mother. On a raw, soggy day in March of 1936, she discovers this woman who was near a pea pickers camp, knowing that the pea crop had frozen. And after pulling into the lane, Lang approaches the female migrant worker, who you see here, asked her permission to photograph her, and shot just the 5 exposures. Her notes read, and I quote, "I did not ask her name or her history. She told me her age, that she was 32. She said that she'd been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children had killed. She just sold the tires from her car to buy food." Now, I might mention that as life goes on, we spend a lot of time analyzing this photograph. You'll notice that she even burns out there's another child's finger. Lang is very good in the darkroom. This child has brilliant highlights. It is a gorgeous image. Okay. Now, this photograph really exudes the sort of this permanent grapes of wrath stereotype on Florence Owens Thompson, who herself was biracial and part Native American. And her life was much more complex than just being frozen in this image, but she was known throughout her life as a consequence of being in this image as a migrant mother. And she was quite angry over that. They even dedicated a postage stamp to her. And this image, which she didn't receive a penny for, this is the image in your book showing you how it appeared in reports, became a postage stamp, became look into her eyes, see the plight of this Madonna of the Great Depression, and of course, send your sympathies and empathies and be supportive of relief efforts to help these poor migrant people. Okay, now what makes it iconic is its simplicity, that we look straight into her eyes. We see how wrinkled and worried she is, that she has all these mouths to feed. And then we also don't know what her fate would be. Consequently, by the way, days later, lots of help arrives at this pea pickers camp. But Thompson has moved on because the story that Lang told about this image was incorrect. There was a car, and her boyfriend was out in the car. Her boyfriend was taking the car to get a part fixed on the car, but the car would be back and would take them on to the next place. So sadly, they eked out a meager living and received absolutely none of the aid that this image helped the American government part with to help these people. So anyway, now having lived in the shadow of being migrant mother her whole life, and she got absolutely no monetary reward for being this icon for suffering during the Great Depression, Florence Owens Thompson was quite upset. Now, to give you an idea of how these images live when they are taken into publication, this is an image by Lang, and you can see her husband, Paul Taylor, on the left edge. He's having a smoke and talking to this plantation owner, according to the title, and his farm work hands as he has his foot up on his car, which appears to be a fairly new car. Now, this is an image that Lang took when she was expecting we might be able to see the race divisions and the fat cat white guy versus the black guys. And this is kind of how the different frames looked. And the image on the far right is the cropped version with barely a black person in it, which ended up next to a poem by Archibald MacLeish in Land of the Free, which is talking about fortitude and Americanisms and the Battle of Bunker Hill and the grit that you have in your craw, and literally how the Constitution and the right to be tough during the greatest of hard times is something that's inspiringly American. And in another book, you can see that there is a different crop that appears that brings the Black man into the story yet more. So everywhere these images ran, they were packaged quite differently for different reasons, and the photographers couldn't do a thing about it. Perhaps one of the famous images that has to deal with race, the famous projects that has to do with race, is the work of Gordon Parks, who's a Black man from Kansas, who came into the FSA in the late 1930s. He decides to follow Miss Ella Watson, as you can see here, who worked for the government and also helped take care of her grandchildren. Here she is leaving for work at 4:30 p.m., where she worked the night shift, taking care of and cleaning government buildings, and spent the day taking care of her grandchildren and her adopted daughter. Here we see a close-up of her in an image that has also been called American Gothic. And the close-up has Ella Watson, who'd mopped floors for the government all her life, posed with a mop and a broom in front of an American flag. After a day of facing prejudice in restaurants and stores, Parks said he was angry when he took the photograph. He said, I'd known poverty firsthand, but I learned how to fight off its evil, along with the evil of racism, with a camera. And here we have, of course, this matriarch with many adopted children and grandchildren who's tough, who is working very hard. But then we also see these images juxtaposed with images of her home life and also her navigating a segregated world. Now, FSA did not know what to do about the race questions. So it basically ignored them because in the 1940s and 30s, as you could see, that FSA was not sure what to do about that. It is named, of course, because of its association with the Grant Wood's American Gothic, was also refers to this sort of Americana and the left side, the Americana of the Midwest versus here's this woman facing a very different kind of Americana that's not about her owning her own farm, but her cleaning up government buildings. Okay. Now, Marion Post Wolcott, another female photographer with FSA, here photographs segregation in action as we see a Black man going up to the separate Black admissions of a segregated theater. You have these beautiful juxtapositions of commerce and also signage, and this, of course, organic shape of the man slowly going up the stairs. We also had Carl Mydans had created an a FSA photographs plus poetry book called 12 Million Black Voices. And this is Black Yard Alley Dwelling, showing you how modest some of the least privileged during the Great Depression really were. This was set to the prose of Richard Wright, who is author of Native Son. And this image was to talk about 12 Million Black Voices and how they survived the Great Depression. Okay, now Stryker, just sort of to encapsulate this, once remarked that the triumph of all of this work for FSA was that it helped connect one's generation's image of itself with the reality of its own time in history. And it does show in many ways in all of these images the fundamental realities of the Great Depression. And it teaches that old age platitudes or age old platitudes are not enough to manage and inspire a myriad of people in a modern democracy, but just that the Great Depression was experienced variously by lots of different people. Okay, Now, just to kind of take a breath, this is a different set of project, and the subject of race is still and was in the 1930s elsewhere and in the 20s, and a serious and unaddressed one. But in Harlem, a neighborhood in New York that was predominantly Black, we have a booming during the Jazz Age in the 1920s and into the 30s, Great Depression, a booming set of photographers, including James Van Der Zee, who would photograph the new rise of middle class in Harlem. And we see affluence here in couple in raccoon coats by these brownstone buildings, and we see at the height of the Great Depression, wealth among, in other words, quite a different experience that would inspire the Great Migration North, because, of course, people who are living in poverty, like this guy, would see photographs like this taken by Black photographers and look to join communities in northern cities. A couple brothers, Marvin and Morgan Smith, were twins who ran a Harlem portrait studio and recorded social affairs, political events. Jackie Robinson and his son and a baseball bat. All of this iconic sort of jazz happening at the Savvy. And the rise of Harlem would be very well documented. We also would have Bernice Abbott, who was working for the WPA, which was the Works Project Administration of the New Deal, chronicling the growth of New York City in a 4-year project called Changing New York. And she would move to New York from Ohio, where she studied sculpture and met avant-garde artists like Duchamp and Man Ray, and would work for as assistant to Man Ray, learn photography, and clearly went out and did it. So, okay. So just to kind of clear the runway a little bit, I'd like to introduce you to the very last topic of our video here, which is the Family of Man exhibition, which was 1955 at the Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, in New York. So in 1955, World War II had just ended. The USA suffered little damage to its country aside from Pearl Harbor. At the start of the Cold War with Russia, communism was in a standoff with capitalism, and Europe and Asia staggered under the losses of millions of people, coupled with economic devastation and physical devastation. So a lot is happening. So we have a world that very much needs to come together. So MoMA hires Steichen, who you guys know from before. And in fact, here's Steichen, who looks a little bit like a little cherubian garden gnome. But this is not pictorialist Steichen. This is a curator Steichen, who is in charge of their photography department. So showing that he truly created a place for photography among fine arts. And here we have photography living among fine arts. The layouts included images from around the world that anybody could submit that were not always intended to be. There were 2.5 million photographs submitted for potential inclusion. They looked for images that read quickly, were iconic. They ended up selecting 508 images from 273 photographers from 68 countries, removed the context, no captions, and obviously resized and laid them out as if you were walking through a magazine. Everything was divided by theme, and those themes included, as you see here, family. And notice that there was some brilliant sculptural things. Work. There was also an area for love. And there was, of course, an exhibition catalog. This is the opening shot of that book called Child in a Forest. Steichen liked it because he thought that it was talking about the idea of the primordial woman in the way that is sort of a surrealist way in nature. But here's the text interacting with something from love, And then we have love, lots of different ways around the world. We have pregnancy and motherhood. Childbirth happens around the world. Motherhood around the world. Parenting, motherhood, fatherhood. And notice how that it tries to bring the world together under these common experiences that we all share. But I do want to point out that this is a different kind of experience of fatherhood and life than these are. Here's family. Here's work. And I do want to point out that there's a big difference between in Russia taking a sickle out and cutting down all your wheat and having rows of combines do your harvest for you. So there were critics saying that there were inequities in these images, that even if you show us poverty, which is a commonality throughout the world, migrant mother pales in comparison to the suffering of other cultures. But the rhetoric of the exhibition was we too form a multitude, that we share so much in common that we are likely to forget the only color image, and it's right here at the very end of the exhibition, which is the bomb going off. And notice how these are just crowds of people. So what this is meant to do is downplay individuality in favor of a collective unity. And that was the entire mission, which I believe a lot of people criticized as being a little idealistic and not taking into account differences. Okay, guys, that is it for this set of images. I will see you next time, in which I'll talk about Ouija, photographing the gritty city, and I'll start introducing you to greats like Deanne Arbus. All right, have a great weekend, guys. Bye.